Thank you so much. Before I begin, I just want to say what an honor it is for me to be here. I started working this. This book started as a very long process. It took me 10 years. And Professor Margaret Chowning was always there supporting me and giving me ideas. And the book is so much stronger thanks to her. So it was really quite an honor to be here. And the other person who really meant a lot was Julia. Julia was my student at Stanford. And so when she told me that she's now here at the Center for Latin American Studies, I really wanted to do it. So it's really an honor to be here and to get to meet you all. Let me begin. Approximately 40% of all Mexicans who come from the state of Zacatecas now reside in the United States. Similarly, 1/3 of all of those from the state of Guanajuato now live north of the border. And more than 1/2 of Michoacanos, those from the state of Michoacán, now work in the fields of California, Oregon, and Illinois than the number of Michoacanos who still reside in their home state. Latinos have become the largest minority group in the United States, constituting approximately 18% of the population. There are an estimated 11 million undocumented migrants in this country, approximately half of them from Mexico. The sheer number of Mexicans who migrated to the United States and their importance in politics, economics, and daily social relations means that their stories have helped to shape both US and Mexican national histories. Yet few historians have paid attention to the causes and effects of Mexican migration in Mexico, and even fewer to how this phenomenon has affected life in both countries and created transnational relations between them. My book, Undocumented Lives, The Untold Story of Mexican Migration, examines the history in the post-war years. It does so by using sources from the national archives of both countries, by using migrants' personal collections, which include things such as the love letters that migrants sent back home and the records of their meetings, and by using over 250 oral history interviews that I conducted on both sides of the border, particularly with people from these states of Michoacán, Guanajuato, and Zacatecas, states with historically high rates of out-migration. Using these sources, I examine how unauthorized Mexican migration became an entrenched phenomenon in the years between 1965 and 1986. I use these two dates as bookends to my work because they mark important turning points in the history of Mexican migration. In 1964, the United States ended the Bracero program, a bilateral guest worker program through which Mexican workers could come, work for short periods of time here in the United States, and then return to Mexico. In 1965, Mexican workers found that they had become accustomed to coming regularly to the United States through the Bracero program, but they could no longer do so because the Bracero program had ended. So instead of migrating with the program, they simply came here illegally. Still, their migration continued to be, as with the Bracero program, for the most part circular. Workers would come, live in the United States for a short period of time, return to Mexico, and then begin the process all over again. This pattern ended in 1986, when the US Congress passed the Immigration Reform and Control Act. One of the main clauses of this act was border fortification. The act allocated significant resources to expand the Border Patrol as well as technologies to catch undocumented migrants. As the border became harder to cross, many Mexicans decided to settle in the United States as they could no longer come and go. They feared that if they dared to go back to Mexico, they would simply not be able to return back into the United States. The years ranging between 1965 and 1986 were ones in which many of the current dilemmas around unauthorized migration were born. This period saw the unprecedented rise of undocumented migration. The apprehensions by the Immigration and Naturalization Service, or the INS, rose from 55,000 in 1965 to over 1.5 million by 1986, a 3,000% overall increase. This period also saw key shifts in the government positions of both countries with regard to migration. And more important, it was during these years that the Mexican people started to realize that they were going to live in the United States and that their lives depended on undocumented migration. To explore this history today and bring out the changing political perspectives of Mexican and US government officials, as well as the lived experiences of undocumented migrants themselves, I will focus on questions of welfare. I focus on this question of welfare because welfare was the language that all actors used when thinking about undocumented migration. Using welfare as the thread that runs throughout the talk, I make two main arguments. First, I argue that during the 1970s, working-class Mexican men faced exclusionary pressures to leave both Mexico and the United States. These double exclusions, these pressures to leave both countries, were enacted both by the government officials of each country as well as by their own communities. Let me explain this point a little bit further. In Mexico, the country's top politicians concluded that because the nation could no longer absorb so many people, the country's well-being depended on encouraging and facilitating Mexicans' migration to the United States. On the other side, in the United States, migrants found themselves increasingly classified as illegal aliens who were accused of draining the nation's welfare resources, and they were regularly deported. Migrants' own communities came to reject migrants' permanent presence in either Mexico or the United States. Increasingly, migrants found that they could belong nowhere, and they started to claim that they were from neither here nor there, ni de aquí, ni de allá. Now, my second argument, which is also threaded through the theme of welfare, is that during this period, migrants advanced their own visions of where they belonged. By doing so, they countered their double exclusion in Mexico and the United States. In particular, I focus on how they created groups in Los Angeles that provided economic security both to migrants who were living in the United States as well as to their communities back in Mexico. By guaranteeing that those back home had their basic needs satisfied, these groups started to act, I argue, as a type of extraterritorial welfare state. Through this activism, migrants managed to become central players in regional, national, and transnational politics. To make these arguments, I will first show how the US government, then the Mexican government, and then Mexican communities used ideas of welfare to deny migrants the right to settle permanently in any place. I will then move on to show how, by creating welfare organizations, migrants managed to assert their own cartographies of belonging. Let's start in the United States, where one of the main rallying cries against unauthorized migrants was that they drained the nation's welfare coffers. The rise of unemployment and inflation simultaneously occurred during the 1970s, and it was something that the US economy had never seen. People started to think that the country was seeing what was known as a welfare mess. And they blame the quote-unquote black, promiscuous, Cadillac-driving welfare queen. As such, most historians have focused on the cultural associations between black people and welfare abuse. But in fact, undocumented Mexican migrants were also consistently accused of draining the nation's welfare resources. For example, articles in newspapers came out with titles such as "Illegal Aliens Here, Called Public Services Burden," and "Welfare System, a Haven for Illegal Aliens." Mexicans tried to counter these stereotypes by blaming US-born Mexican Americans for the existing associations between Mexicans and welfare abuse. For instance, Agapito Rodriguez, who migrated from Zacatecas, held that everyone in the migrant community from which he was from believed that it was US-born Mexican Americans rather than Mexican migrants who were the true welfare abusers. Among his friends, he claimed Mexican Americans were seen as lazy people. We, migrants, would go to work, but those people generally did not work, but instead survived from welfare. This commonly used strategy of shunning other marginalized groups did not help undocumented Mexicans who continued to be accused of draining public welfare. These associations were particularly unsuitable because unauthorized Mexican migrants were ineligible for welfare and few dared to apply for this aid illegally. At least 6 different field studies published at the time showed that undocumented Mexicans rarely used tax-supported programs for unemployment compensation, welfare assistance, or food stamps. What this meant was that Mexican migrants were simultaneously accused of draining the nation's welfare coffers, of abusing welfare, and at the same time prevented from applying for it. Still, one of the main arguments heard in Congress against undocumented migrants was that they abused welfare. In 1976, those who wanted to limit the number of Mexicans in the United States had a clear victory with the passage of the Western Hemisphere Act. This act established an annual quota of 20,000 immigrants per nation per year from countries in the Western Hemisphere. And this was a clause that only affected Mexico, as it was the only country with an immigration rate much higher than 20,000 immigrants per year. The passage of the bill was defended in part through arguments such as those of Senator Thurmond of South Carolina, who argued that in many cases, these illegal entrants and their families soon become a welfare burden on our society, supported in one way or another by American taxpayers. Arguments that Mexican migrants abused welfare did not simply affect the marking of the border through legislative means, but they also encouraged the INS to increase the number of raids it conducted. In June 1973, Donald T. Williams, then acting director of the INS, explained the increasing number of raids by stating, "Immigrants attend schools at taxpayers' expense. They take jobs that normally would go to Americans, and many of them go on welfare and use other public social services." Let me summarize. Up to now, I have been arguing that notions of welfare played a significant role in pushing migrants out of the United States by encouraging US officials to introduce legislative changes to immigration law and by encouraging them to conduct more raids on migrant communities. Although Mexicans kept crossing the border and living in the United States without papers, policymakers accused them of being outsider, illegal aliens who drained public welfare. Now let me turn to the case of Mexico to show how, like US officials, Mexican officials also started to reject migrants' presence in their country during the 1970s. The Mexican government had a very different rhetoric on welfare than did US policymakers. After the Mexican Revolution, the PRI, which was the ruling party, established itself as the promoter of a Mexican welfare state. But even though the government legitimized itself through claims that it was a welfare state, it failed to provide people with their basic needs. Up until the 1970s, Mexican policymakers had long considered that to achieve a welfare state and accelerate economic growth, they had to increase the number of people who resided in Mexico. In fact, since Mexico's independence, the government had zealously pursued population growth policies in an attempt to have a large and dynamic workforce. Now, in terms of migration, what this meant was encouraging those who had already gone to the United States to return to Mexico, while discouraging those who had not yet migrating from leaving the country. In the mid-1970s, Mexico's top politicians started to change their position, in part and primarily because of a collapsing economy. During these years, the balance of payment ran a huge deficit and consumer prices doubled. Before leaving office in 1976, President Luis Echeverría was forced to devalue the peso, ask for assistance from the IMF, and accept its austerity package. The period between 1970 and 1982 saw so many difficulties that many Mexicans referred to them as the tragic dozen. Mexican officials started to debate how to solve the nation's economic problems. Should they continue to promote their welfare state? Should they change their position? Ultimately, they concluded that population growth was no longer advantageous. If anything, Mexico's population had to be reduced. One way to do this was by accepting and even by encouraging citizens' emigration to the United States. Existing government archives contain limited explicit evidence in which policymakers openly acknowledge changing their views on emigration as a means of alleviating Mexico's economic problems. Speaking of such a change would have meant recognizing that the PRI was giving up on the revolution's welfare goals of providing Mexicans with the means of residing with humane living standards in their country of birth. It would have also meant acknowledging that the government had come to reject the presence of its own citizens in Mexico and instead was supporting their migration to a country where they were seen as illegals. Despite the paucity of such explicit evidence, the jumbled changes in the state practices that occurred between the mid-1960s and the mid-1980s elucidate politicians' changing position. Let me give you a couple of examples that illustrate how Mexican government officials went from discouraging unauthorized migration to viewing it as necessary. First, from the 1940s to the mid-1970s, Mexican and US migratory officials had coordinated mechanisms to repatriate Mexicans deep into the interior of Mexico. They knew that if they apprehended Mexicans and they deported them and they released them right by the border, right in northern Mexico, these deportees would simply cross over the border and enter the United States the following day. So what they tried to do was to separate them from the border. The mechanism they introduced worked like this. Border Patrol officials or immigration officials would apprehend migrants and would take them right to the border region, where they would hand them over to officials from Mexico's Department of Migration, which was then in charge of taking these migrants into the interior of Mexico. And we can see this happening here, where a line of men who has been apprehended is about to board a train into the interior of Mexico, and we can see some officials from Mexico's Departamento de Migración, Department of Migration. Now, this happened up until the mid-1970s, but in the mid-1970s, when Mexican officials started to change their position regarding migration, they stopped attempting to separate deportees from the border. This change began in 1976, when US officials wanted to sign a $2 million contract to airlift the deportees deep into the interior of Mexico. The Mexican government refused to give these companies permission to land. They claimed that the deportees had a constitutional right to stay in northern Mexico if they so desire. Of course, before the mid-1970s, these constitutional rights did not seem that important. Another example of politicians changing position is that by the mid-1970s, they started focusing on defending the rights of undocumented workers in the United States. Such attempts to protect Mexicans in the United States are not mentioned in government documents until after Mexico's government officials changed their views on immigration. The Migratory Worker Archives, which document all the instances in which Mexican consuls here in the United States supported citizens in the United States, have no mention of consuls supporting undocumented migrants until the mid-1970s. On the contrary, existing government documents show how, before the mid-1970s, Mexican officials insisted that Mexicans who migrated illegally would not be protected. In fact, in these earlier years, officials would often tell citizens directly that they should not migrate without papers because this would make them vulnerable and render them rightless. The strategy, for example, emerges in the correspondence that government officials sent to Epifanio Quintin. On September 30, 1968, Epifanio Quintin's son, after he was asphyxiated in a U-Haul truck while trying to enter the United States. For Quintin's family, the tragedy was compounded by their poverty. As Epifanio Quintin explained to the Mexican consul in San Antonio, he could not support his son's wife and children with the 5 daily pesos that he made as an ice cream vendor. Quintin requested that the Mexican government allow one of his other sons to come to the United States to work as a bracero in order to prevent his grandsons from becoming homeless. Government officials replied that they could not authorize the departure of Quintin's other sons because the bracero program had officially ended. They added that they considered it convenient to emphasize that Quintin's sons not abandoned their residence without the existence of a legally authorized work contract, as they would otherwise expose themselves to leaving the country without the protection of the law and would run the risks to which those who break such laws are exposed. Before the mid-1970s, officials insisted that migrants lost their right to protection as a result of their undocumented migration. In contrast, after the mid-1970s, government officials repeatedly informed migrants of their aims to defend them. In 1978, for example, the government publicly announced the opening of the first office for the protection of human rights of undocumented Mexicans in the United States. This new interest in the human rights of Mexicans who resided in the United States is particularly surprising given the government's blatant disregard for the rights of Mexicans who still resided in Mexico. As Human Rights Watch noted, since the late 1960s and early 1970s, an array of abuses have become an institutionalized part of Mexican society, including killings, torture, abuses against independent unions, and violations of the freedom of press. Officials' interest in the human rights of citizens in the United States and their concurrent lack of concern for them while in Mexico was related to their belief that many of its citizens ought to live north of the border. After Mexican officials changed their views regarding migration, they also openly attempted to convince the United States to allow more undocumented migrants to reside there. They even did so by fanning out Cold War fears. In a speech delivered to U.S. officials in 1979, Mexico's Secretary of Foreign Relations, Jorge Castañeda, asserted that the United States was not giving Mexico special consideration. Given that there was no real special relationship between the two countries, he said, Mexico could also look to Latin America, as well as, quote, to Europe, Japan, the socialist countries. In this not-so-veiled threat, he impressed upon the United States how important immigration was for Mexico's government. So, before I continue, up to now, I have been arguing that during the 1970s, ideas of welfare pushed forward the view that Mexicans did not belong in the United States. These notions encouraged U.S. government officials to deport more Mexicans and made it harder for migrants to enter the United States. During this same decade, Mexican authorities themselves started to reject the presence of migrants in Mexico. While the Mexican government had previously attempted to act like a welfare state, and it still portrayed itself as such, by the mid-1970s, officials believed that the way forward was to encourage workers from Mexico to live in a country that viewed them as illegals. Now that I have examined how migrants experienced a double exclusion from Mexico and the United States because of pressures enacted by both governments, let me turn to the pressures migrants faced from their own communities. At the local level, migrants' families and friends also started to deny them the ability to reside in either country on a permanent basis. Because the Mexican government failed to act as a true welfare state on which people could rely on in time of need, family members and community members started to expect men to head to the United States to make money. Antonio Cordova, from the town of Sinsunzan, Michoacan, recalls that before he started migrating, he decided to meet with government officials and ask them for welfare help so that he could buy oxen. He believed that with this little help, he would be able to support his family and not have to go north. But he recalls that the representatives just said, "Go, I'll examine your case on this date or on that date," but they never did anything. Without prospects for jobs and nowhere to turn for help, Cordova knew that he would have to migrate. His own family members insisted that he go to the United States to support them. Now, as you might have picked up from this example, Mexican migration had a profound gender dimension, one that had unexpected and unexplored effects that have not yet been fully appreciated. In Mexican communities, men bore the pressure to migrate to support their families. Although some women also migrated to work during the years between 1965 and 1986, it was mostly men who migrated, and the community pressure to do so fell almost strictly on them. After all, it was extremely expensive for one person to come to the United States, and almost impossible for a whole family to do so. This was in part because smugglers' fees had become so expensive during this period. Now, divisions of labor in the family meant that the man was encouraged to make money by going to the United States, while the woman remained in Mexico taking care of the children. As Maria Reyes from Nochistlán, Zacatecas recalls, "I thought about migrating, but I couldn't because of my many children. I was tired of being alone while my husband was in the United States. I would tell him, 'Take me with you,' and he would say, 'How can I take you with me? First, where would we stay? We're too many. Second, how can I take you when it's so hard to cross children?'" Like most women, Reyes never considered asking her husband to look after the children while she migrated and remitted money for the family. Women were also discouraged from migrating because of sexual violence at the border. Horrifying stories of the dangers that women faced while crossing the border circulated in migrant communities and discouraged many women from heading north. For instance, in the town of Ruiz Cortines, Michoacan, women warned each other against trying their luck in El Norte by gossiping about a female villager who had been raped by her smuggler. After that, they held her life was no longer good. While women were discouraged from heading to the United States, men felt pressured to do so. Significantly, it was women in their roles as wives and mothers who were often the main people who pushed men to migrate. For instance, Eloisa Garza from Nochistlán, Zacatecas, recalls that like many women, she insisted that her husband migrate because her family's welfare depended on it. Because he had to make money to support us, he had to work to be able to provide us with food, because in Mexico, life is very hard. Her husband's parents and friends also pushed him to go. The staggering rates of male migration meant that many men started to feel inadequate if they did not go to the United States to provide for their families. Migrating to support their own family's welfare became a way in which men could establish their manhood. Rafael Ruano recalls that, like many other men, he migrated with 3 friends who pressured each other into taking the journey. Had Ruano not migrated with his friends, he would have felt cowardly, and he claims that he probably would have been ridiculed. Community pressure changed the ways many men felt about the space of their hometown. In oral history interviews, they regularly described the pressures they faced to head north as if their own hometown were squeezing in around them and pushing them out. As Ricardo Perez explained, everyone expected me to leave and come back with money. I felt like I couldn't remain in town without going to the United States. But once in the United States, men felt that their loved ones, the very people who had pressured them to go north in the first place, now encouraged them to return back to Mexico. Once men were abroad, their wives, children, and parents regularly pressured them to return home. Everardo Camacho recalls that his wife and daughter reproached him for leaving them alone too much during his stays abroad. From the United States, men would receive letters from their families begging them to return home soon. Men also felt pressure to return home again to establish their manhood. To prove their manliness, men did not only have to migrate, but they had to return to their hometown, improve their home, and flaunt the money that they had made. In fact, even before men left for the United States, they knew that El Norte was a place where they would only reside in temporarily. Up to now, I have shown how men came to see their hometowns as spaces that shrunk around them and squeezed them out of their towns, and how the United States was a place where they could only reside in temporarily. It is important to note, however, that women themselves also saw their sense of space diminish as a result of men's migration. After going to the United States, many men started to fear that their wives would cheat on them and started prohibiting them from leaving the house to socialize outside. According to Ana Beltrán, who lived in Santa Fe de la Laguna, Michoacán, villagers often gossiped that women who socialized outdoors were being unfaithful to their husbands. Because rumors of presumed infidelities often reached El Norte, women started to fear that if they spent too much time outdoors, their husbands would find out and stop sending them remittances. As such, many women started to stay indoors as much as possible. Migration is often associated with the sense of cosmopolitanism and the opening of people's worlds. But when it came to unauthorized Mexican migration, both men and women saw their sense of space diminish in significant ways as a result of men's migration. Let me summarize what I have been saying up to now about the pressure migrants experienced on both sides of the border. Migrants faced a double exclusion that prevented them from residing in Mexico and in the United States. This exclusion was enforced by government officials from both countries as well as by their own friends and families. Mexico's leaders viewed migrants as economically superfluous and favored their departures from Mexico. U.S. officials came to consider migrants as draining welfare resources and regularly deported them from the United States. Migrants' own communities rejected their permanent presence in either country by holding that their own welfare depended on migrants' remittances and return visits. Now, in this context, migrants sought to assert their local, regional, and national belonging by creating their own welfare organizations. To demonstrate this, I am going to focus on the activism of Mexican nationals in Los Angeles. In 1931, Mexicans established the Comité de Beneficencia Mexicana, often referred to in English as the Mexican Welfare Committee. By the 1970s, most of the members of this institution were Mexican migrants who contributed their own time and effort to helping those in need. When one examines the applications for relief that the Comité received, a paradox regarding welfare soon becomes clear. As we have seen, U.S. anti-immigrant practices were often influenced by the rhetoric that Mexicans abused welfare. But these exclusionary practices themselves were often responsible for driving migrants into seeking welfare. For example, in 1970, immigration officials detained 24-year Ubaldo Rosas to deport him back to Mazatlan, Sinaloa. On the train ride south, the officers beat him and confiscated his belongings. Fearing for his safety, Rosas jumped from the train, but he miscalculated the distance and fell on the rails. Rosas severed both legs and 2 fingers from his left hand. He came to require a wheelchair. He solicited welfare aid, but not from the US government, but from the Comité. Border enforcement led Rosas to seek these welfare aid, yet rather than resorting to US welfare resources, Rosas came to depend on the support of other migrants. The Comité provided Rosas with financial support and with the wheelchair that he needed. The Comité became so influential that Mexican consuls and even the LAPD and US health officials sent Mexican nationals to seek aid from this organization. In other words, migrants became central players in providing each other with their basic necessities in the United States. The Comité raised money primarily by renting out a building it owned called La Casa del Mexicano. And here's a picture of how La Casa del Mexicano looked. By the 1970s, the main groups that rented out La Casa were clubes sociales, often known by their contemporary term of hometown associations. These clubs worked to send funds across the border to develop communities in Mexico. As a result, they acted in very different ways from the mutual aid societies that historians have studied, which have been used to support migrants in the United States. Instead, clubes sociales, I argued, acted as a type of extraterritorial welfare state. From the United States, clubs took on the role of the Mexican government and sought to ensure that all Mexicans were able to stay in Mexico with their basic needs satisfied. Activists themselves have this interpretation. In his unpublished memoirs, Raúl Villarreal, who was one of the main club activists, writes that his story is one of a simple dishwasher from a Los Angeles restaurant who, by working in clubes sociales, ended up helping the people of Mexico more than the government itself. These groups started as small organizations. In 1962, a group of migrants in Los Angeles who had all come from the small Mexican rancho of Guadalupe Victoria, which is located in the state of Zacatecas, decided to start raising funds to send back home. To do this, they started to coordinate small-scale social affairs, such as picnics in Lincoln Park. Members would donate the food, they would cook it themselves, and then they would buy it at the picnics to raise money. And here we can see that these organizations were very small when they first began. These are all the members of the Club Social Guadalupe Victoria, and we can see that each member is giving $1. So they didn't manage to raise many funds at the beginning. However, soon this small group managed to inspire other migrants from other communities in Mexico to start their own clubes sociales. And by the early 1970s, a large community had developed in Los Angeles to send money back to Mexico. The club culture that took shape in La Casa del Mexicano revolved around dances that took place every weekend. Parties would begin generally around 8:30 p.m. and they would end around 2 a.m. As they rode on, people would dance, laugh, and converse until the music ended. Once the party ended, migrants left with a renewed sense of community and belonging. The hosting club with a profit of approximately $600. Club members sent the money they collected to local agents in Mexico who were in charge of managing the funds. For example, the Club Social Guadalupe Victoria remitted the money migrants fundraised to club agents residing in the rancho. These agents then distributed it to the elderly on a weekly basis. As the club developed, it started to take on bigger and bigger projects. By 1987, the club had also paved the rancho's main street, fenced its school, set up electric power lines, brought potable water, and built a clinic. And this is how the clinic looks nowadays. In other words, migrants in the United States raised money, and club representatives in Mexico ensured that it was appropriately distributed. Together, they formed a welfare system that guaranteed that the rancho's basic necessities were met. Migrants felt that their families pushed them to engage in circular migration, which prevented them from settling in either country in a permanent basis. But through their activism in clubs, migrants managed to become central figures in these very hometowns from which they were being pushed. From the United States, migrants changed the built environment and living conditions in Mexican streets. When people walked through these paved streets, when they attended clinics, when they did as much as switch on their lights, they had to think about migrants' contributions. The very meaning of hometown became imbued with migration. Similarly, by creating long-lasting spaces where they could gather in the United States, migrants managed to build a community north of the border, despite the impermanence of their individual stays there. Club members realized that they were taking on responsibilities traditionally assumed by the state, but they argued that if they did not do it, the state would not either. As Gregorio Casillas, who was one of the main activists, argued, the government wasn't interested. For example, it is the government's obligation to provide what the community needs, like electric light, clinics, schools, but unfortunately they didn't do it, so we had to intervene. From the 1960s to the mid-1980s, the Mexican government ignored clubs. Finally, in 1986, Zacatecas Governor Genaro Borrego realized that given the importance that clubs were having in his state, he could no longer continue to ignore their activities. That year, he agreed to develop a program by which his state government would match every dollar that clubs sent for the betterment of the state. This agreement marked the first time that migrants were granted official recognition by a state government in Mexico. In 1999, the federal government began the Programa 3x1, or 3-for-1, by which federal, municipal, and state governments all give $1 for every dollar that migrants send for the betterment of their communities. In 1986, the year that Borrego got involved with club activities, the U.S. Congress passed the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which further fortified the U.S.-Mexico border. By then, however, undocumented migration had already become a self-perpetuating phenomenon. Migrants, such as those involved in clubs, had learned that through their migration, they could at least acquire partial national and local belonging. Because crossing the border became increasingly dangerous, men started refraining from circular migration and instead encouraged their whole families to cross the border once and relocate permanently in the United States. They did not dare head back to Mexico for fear that they would not be able to cross the border back north. Now, rather than feeling pushed from all the spaces in which they resided and being from neither here nor there, they felt entrapped in the United States, which they came to refer to as La Jaula de Oro, or the Golden Cage. My talk has focused on how, in the years between 1965 and 1986, migrants faced a double exclusion from Mexico and the United States, but how they managed to assert their own cartographies of belonging through their activism. Among other issues, my book also examines how, in towns of high out-migration, gay men were the only ones who could refrain from migrating and still move around the town freely. Similarly, it demonstrates how clubs were not the only form of activism in which migrants engaged, and it shows how the positions of the government officials of both countries were interrelated with global economic developments. As such, I offer a transnational perspective on the history of Mexican migration and the growth of Latino communities. As a conclusion to today's talk, let me point to some of the ways in which the history I just recounted sheds light on the present situation facing undocumented Mexicans in the United States. A growing number of US citizens are once again resorting to 1970s stereotypes that portray Mexicans as draining welfare and calling for their deportation. Mexican government officials continue to view with favor citizens' departures from the United States, and even now have not instituted proper ways, effective ways, to incorporate deported migrants into Mexico's economy. Politicians like Trump continue to ignore how border fortification in fact increased the number of people residing in the United States. While before 1986, it was primarily men who migrated, and they did so in a circular fashion. After the border was fortified in 1986, entire families started to migrate and to settle permanently in the United States. But this history also shows how, by uniting, migrants can improve their conditions and achieve local, national, and transnational recognition and even rights against all odds. After all, the years between the 1960s and the 1980s are ones which both Mexicanists and US historians describe as ones which saw a rapid shift from the political left to the political right, a decline in leftist activism, and the growing demonization of the welfare state. Still, during these years, unauthorized Mexican workers managed to create their own cross-border welfare institutions and to fight for their needs in both countries. Thank you very much.